First class, Julian said smugly. You don't see someone like you up here every day. But he had no idea who was standing in front of him in the luxurious first-class cabin. A man full of self-importance decided to mock a calm stranger dressed in jeans and a plaid shirt, but within minutes, the entire plane would witness how one remark turned into a public lesson and changed a life forever. As always, San Francisco Airport buzzed with activity. Travelers rushed about, voices mixed into a steady hum, and luggage wheels clattered across the floor. Amid the movement, one man stood out by his stillness in the first-class line. That man was Arnold Schwarzenegger. His appearance was modest, a plaid shirt, faded jeans, and boots that had clearly seen better days. He had a backpack slung over his shoulder that looked like it had been on countless journeys. There was nothing flashy about him, and maybe because of that, most people overlooked him. But those who looked closer could sense there was something different about him. It wasn't just his clothes, it was the quiet composure he carried. He had the air of someone untouched by the chaos surrounding him. While others rushed about, tense and hurried, Arnold remained still, serene, almost grounded. He took it all in calmly, as though simply observing the world unfold around him. The contrast between him and the other passengers didn't seem to bother him in the slightest. Standing just behind him in line was Julian Price, a man who couldn't have been more different. Julian wore a tailored suit, his shoes gleamed, and he was enveloped in a scent designed to turn heads. Every gesture he made seemed deliberate, as if crafted to declare his importance. As he scanned the line, his gaze landed on Arnold, and he couldn't resist making a remark. First class, huh? Julian said with a smirk. You never know who might show up these days. Arnold turned his head calmly, meeting his eyes without any shift in expression. Yeah, he said. The world's full of surprises. Julian's face tightened for a moment, clearly expecting more of a reaction, something to confirm his assumptions. But Arnold didn't take the bait, he let the comment pass as if it had no weight. Julian wasn't ready to let it go just yet. Nothing personal, he added with a chuckle, but you don't exactly look like the type who flies first class. It's not every day you see someone so laid back in this section. Just then, boarding began for first class. Without exchanging another word, the two men moved forward with their tickets. Julian walked ahead with confident, assertive strides, while Arnold maintained his relaxed, unhurried pace. Once inside the plane, the unexpected happened. Julian double-checked his ticket, then glanced up and saw Arnold taking the seat right next to his. You've got to be kidding me, Julian muttered, shaking his head as though it were some kind of joke. He slid into his seat, letting out a short laugh. Of all the seats on this plane, Arnold glanced his way with that same composed expression and offered a slight smile. Looks like we're travel companions, he said, polite and even-toned. Julian folded his arms, clearly trying to mask his discomfort. It wasn't just that Arnold was sitting next to him, it was the realization that the man he'd just dismissed now shared this exclusive space. Something about Arnold's presence made Julian uneasy, though he couldn't explain exactly why. As the rest of the passengers boarded, Julian leaned over, attempting to spark a conversation, though not out of friendliness. So, what do you do? He asked, his tone casual but laced with assumption, as if he already had an answer in mind. Arnold, adjusting his backpack beneath the seat, looked up and replied simply, I work in film. Julian raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. Oh, really? Commercials? Indie gigs? Arnold gave a slight smile and shook his head. Something along those lines. Julian chuckled. Always interesting to see how people try to fit in, you know? But some spaces just aren't for everyone, like first class. Arnold took a moment, studying Julian but remaining composed. I believe everyone has their place, he answered, and sometimes it's exactly where they're meant to be. Julian let out a small laugh. That's cute, philosophical, even, but life's a bit messier than that. Arnold didn't reply. He turned his gaze toward the window, signaling the end of the exchange. Still, Julian wasn't finished. You know something, he said, leaning slightly closer, you might be sitting here, but there are things money just can't buy. Some places can feel unfamiliar to some people no matter how they get there. This time, Arnold didn't answer. He simply looked at Julian calmly, yet with a quiet strength behind his eyes. It was the kind of look that didn't need words to make an impact. Julian, noticing that his attempts to provoke had fallen flat, leaned back with a smug smile. He believed he had the upper hand, but in reality, the story was just beginning. By the time the plane was cruising above the clouds, the in-flight service had begun. The flight attendant made her way through the first-class cabin, offering drinks to the passengers. Julian made sure she noticed him. "I'll have a glass of champagne," he said smoothly, flashing a confident smile. "Something that fits the vibe of this seat." Used to serving demanding travelers, the flight attendant nodded and returned his smile with polite professionalism. When she reached Arnold, his request was far simpler. "Just water, please," he said quietly. Julian couldn't let the moment pass without a jab. He glanced over with a smirk and let out a light chuckle. "Water?" he repeated, almost laughing. "You're really going to sit up here and waste the whole first-class experience on water?" Arnold took the bottle from the attendant and answered evenly, "This is enough for me. Sometimes the simplest things are more than enough." Julian narrowed his eyes, trying to read him, then shrugged and fired back, "Yeah, I guess that's fine for people who settle for less. Not everyone is born to enjoy the finer things in life." Arnold raised the bottle and took a small sip before responding. Around them, a few passengers began to notice the tension in Julian's tone, but since Arnold didn't appear bothered, no one stepped in. "Maybe what's best isn't the same for everyone," Arnold replied softly. His calm demeanor remained unshaken. Julian didn't care for that answer. He took a breath, determined to keep control of the conversation. "Or maybe people who say that never really had access to what truly matters," he said with a smirk. "Not everything is within reach for all of us, and that's just how life works." The flight attendant, now a few rows away, threw a discreet glance in their direction. She seemed to consider stepping in, but seeing how composed Arnold remained, she chose to let it be. Arnold didn't respond with words this time. He simply offered a faint smile and turned to look out the window again. Julian, meanwhile, wasn't satisfied. He still wanted to provoke a reaction, but was slowly realizing that Arnold wasn't easy to shake. He thought he was winning their back and forth, but to the other passengers nearby, his arrogance was becoming more and more uncomfortable. While Arnold remained calm and grounded, Julian was about to be hit with a truth that would challenge his entire worldview. The flight attendant circled back through their section with another round of drinks. Julian, still set on making his point, decided to take another shot. "You know," he said, raising his champagne glass slightly, "life's kind of like first class. You work hard, earn your place, and then you get to enjoy it. But some people, well, let's just say sometimes they're only here because they got lucky." Arnold placed his water bottle on the tray table, then turned to face Julian more directly. His eyes remained calm, but there was something different now, a quiet resolve. "Whether it's luck or hard work," Arnold said gently, "we all land in the same place when the flight ends, don't we?" That response hung in the air. The people nearby, who had been casually listening, now gave their full attention. The cabin was nearly silent, and a few passengers exchanged glances sensing the subtle tension between the two men. Julian forced a smile, though something in Arnold's words had clearly struck a nerve. "Well, I wouldn't go that far," Julian replied. "Some of us are just at a different level. Not everyone appreciates what it means to be here." Arnold leaned forward a bit, folding his arms in front of him. "I think being here," he said, gesturing around the seat, "is less about what you own and more about how you treat people." The words settled into the space around them like a quiet truth. Some passengers nodded slightly, others exchanged glances of approval. Julian, on the other hand, looked visibly uneasy. He let out a short, awkward laugh, but his confidence was starting to crack. "That's easy for you to say," Julian snapped, half rising from his seat. "You don't know anything about me, you've got no clue what I've gone through to get here." Arnold remained seated, his voice calm but unyielding. "You're right," he said. "I don't know your story, but I do know that when someone feels the need to keep proving themselves, it's often because they're trying to cover something up, fear, insecurity, maybe even loneliness." The statement hit hard. Julian stood frozen, his face turning red with emotion, somewhere between anger and shame. For a moment, it looked like he might lash out, but then, with a sudden motion, he stood up sharply, knocking over his empty champagne glass. "So you think you're above me?" he asked, his voice raised but shaky, drawing gasps from the nearby passengers. "You talk like someone who's already figured life out, but you don't know the first thing about surviving in the real world." The entire cabin went silent, stunned by the outburst. A flight attendant rushed over, hoping to de-escalate the tension. Arnold didn't flinch, he stayed seated, meeting Julian's anger with steady eyes. He waited for him to finish before responding. "I don't think I'm better than you," he said softly but clearly. I just believe we all need to stop once in a while and ask ourselves what truly matters. And, Julian, you don't have to prove anything to anyone. The word struck a different chord. Julian was still breathing heavily, but something in Arnold's tone seemed to cut through the noise. Slowly, he sat back down, no longer furious, just quiet. He looked away, avoiding everyone's gaze. His expression was more lost than proud. Julian didn't say a word. Arnold's voice echoed in his head. He had never felt so exposed, so emotionally bare in front of a crowd. But what he didn't realize was that the most impactful moment, whether painful or enlightening, was still on its way. A little later, a flight attendant approached Arnold with a courteous smile. Her voice gently rose above the stillness of the cabin. Mr. Schwarzenegger, the captain asked me to let you know that your connecting flight in Zurich is confirmed. He also sends his regards. The name, Schwarzenegger, seemed to bounce off the cabin walls. Passengers who had been silently observing suddenly perked up, eyes widening with recognition. That's when Julian froze, his expression shifting in slow disbelief. Schwarzenegger, he repeated under his breath. Arnold gave a polite nod to the flight attendant, thanked her, and seemed largely unfazed by the growing attention. He turned to Julian, who now stared at him as if he were seeing someone entirely new. Something wrong, Julian? Arnold asked gently, with the faint trace of a smile. Julian opened his mouth, but the words just wouldn't come. He glanced around, catching the stares of nearby passengers, some curious, others quietly judging. His face was blank, his confidence gone. Julian slowly slumped back in his seat, clearly uncomfortable in his own skin. He started muttering, scrambling for some sort of explanation. I didn't know. I mean, you never said who you were, he finally stammered. I didn't realize it was you. Arnold's voice remained calm, though it carried a certain weight. I didn't think it mattered. I've never been one to lead with my name. Julian sat in silence, then tried to salvage the situation. Look, I didn't mean to offend you. I just didn't realize who I was talking to. Leaning forward slightly, Arnold let out a soft sigh. Knowing who I am doesn't change what was said, he replied. The truth isn't dependent on status, it's revealed in how we choose to treat people. Those words hit Julian hard. He looked at Arnold, then at the faces around him, passengers now completely drawn into the moment. The embarrassment on his face was impossible to miss. Breaking the silence, Arnold added one final thought, almost like a quiet lesson. You know, Julian, life's already difficult for all of us. The last thing we should be doing is tearing others down just to feel a little taller. Julian nodded faintly, unable to offer any comeback. For the first time, he seemed genuinely introspective. Arnold leaned back in his seat again, letting the conversation come to a close. Julian, meanwhile, sat motionless, staring at his hands as though trying to replay the entire exchange in his head. It wasn't just Arnold who had confronted him, it was reality itself. In trying to belittle someone else, he'd ended up exposing parts of himself he never intended to reveal. The cabin remained quiet for the rest of the flight. Julian, once so sure of himself, now looked like a completely different man, restless and humbled. He couldn't bring himself to meet Arnold's eyes or glance at the others around him. Whatever pride he'd carried onto the plane had faded, replaced by a silent kind of shame. The minutes ticked by, but Julian's thoughts stayed fixed on Arnold's words. Everything he had said sounded so simple, yet somehow it cut deep. Julian found himself replaying past moments, realizing how often he judged people without knowing anything about them. Maybe he's right, he whispered under his breath, unaware he'd spoken aloud. He glanced toward Arnold, who was peacefully reading a book, completely at ease. That quiet presence only made the impact stronger. Arnold hadn't tried to prove anything, he had simply let his actions speak louder than words. As the plane began its descent, Julian finally worked up the nerve to say something. Turning slightly toward Arnold, eyes still lowered, he spoke softly. I owe you an apology, not because of who you are, but because I was arrogant. I acted like a fool. Arnold looked up at him, his calm demeanor unchanged. He waited a moment before replying. I appreciate that, Julian, he said. But more than the apology, I hope you take something from this. Julian gave a slow nod, understanding that this wasn't just a conversation, it was a chance to grow. Arnold went on. Sometimes what we chase the most out there, he said, gesturing slightly outward, is what we lack the most inside. I hope you find out what really matters to you. Julian didn't respond, but the words clearly stayed with him. He could feel a shift happening inside, if he was willing to let it happen. After the flight landed, Julian remained standing in the terminal, quietly watching as Arnold walked away. He saw fans approach, asking for photos or simply greeting him with admiration. Arnold met each of them with warmth, patience, and a humble smile, no rush, no ego. It was obvious that his kindness came from a place of sincerity, not image. Julian looked down at his own hands and let out a breath. He knew something had to change. Arnold's words still echoed inside him, a reminder that a person's true value isn't tied to what they show the world, but how they choose to treat it. As Arnold disappeared into the crowd, Julian felt something stirring, hope. Maybe the encounter wasn't random after all, maybe it was a second chance. Because in the end, we're shaped by the choices we make. Are we living to impress, or to improve? Arnold's words carried a lasting message. Real success isn't about how much you accumulate or display, it's about the impact you leave on the world and the people in it. So the next time you're in a moment of judgment or conflict, remember, kindness and humility never go out of style, and maybe the change you want to see around you has to begin within you. Julian watched Arnold's broad back vanish into the crowd, his own heart pounding with the weight of everything that had happened. He stood there for a long moment, surrounded by strangers, yet somehow more alone than ever. The roar of the terminal felt distant, as though muffled by the echo of Arnold's words. Finally, Julian exhaled and moved toward the gate for his connecting flight, each step heavy with newfound humility. At the gate, Julian took a seat and found himself glancing again at Arnold, who was reading calmly on a bench across the hall. Summoning courage, Julian rose and approached him, every fiber of his being resisting the urge to turn back. "Mr. Schwarzenegger," he began, voice tight. Arnold looked up with a welcoming nod. "I hope you don't mind," Julian continued, "but, thank you. For what you said back there. I've spent too long thinking success is measured by status. You showed me it's measured by impact." Arnold closed his book and patted the bench beside him. "Sit," Arnold invited. "It takes real strength to admit you were wrong." Julian sat, and for the first time, the awe that filled the first-class cabin transformed into genuine respect. They spoke quietly about life on the road, about lessons learned in studios and on stages, and about the silent battles each person carries. Arnold shared how, early in his career, he'd been so focused on lifting trophies, physical and metaphorical, that he'd nearly sacrificed friendships and joy. Julian listened, surprised at how someone so iconic had wrestled with the same doubts that kept him awake at night. Before long, Julian found himself opening up, about his relentless drive to outshine others, about the fear that without admiration he'd be nothing. Arnold offered no clichés, only honest reflection. "The biggest victory," he said, "is living in peace with yourself. When you stop chasing applause, you start hearing your own heart." Julian nodded, tears welling behind his sunglasses. They boarded the Zurich flight shoulder to shoulder. This time, Julian made no jokes, only small gestures of kindness, holding the aisle door for the flight attendant, offering a free bottle of water to a nervous child, and thanking the crew with genuine warmth. He noticed the difference in the cabin's energy. Smiles were richer, conversations friendlier. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, Julian had received nods of approval instead of anxious glances. Over the course of the flight, Arnold and Julian exchanged contacts. "If you ever need a reminder," Arnold said with a grin, "call me. I'm not hard to reach." And Julian meant it. He needed reminders, notes in his phone, playlists of motivational talks that didn't revolve around self-promotion. Months later, Julian sat in a boardroom, no longer the same man. He'd launched a small scholarship fund for students with talent but limited means, invested in programs that taught conflict resolution through dialogue, and started each morning with a moment of silence instead of social media. His colleagues noticed the change. The once boastful executive who measured value by revenue now asked, "How can we serve?" His leadership style shifted from commanding to listening, and his team flourished under his encouragement. One afternoon, Julian received a message from Arnold. "Next time you fly, first class isn't what you sit in, it's the space you create for others." Julian smiled, remembering every word. The lesson he tried to mock had become the foundation of a new life. And as he boarded his next flight, always in economy, always among everyday people, he carried Arnold's quiet strength with him, determined to make every interaction a chance to uplift rather than to impress.